I'm pretty sure most of us have seen the movie It. For those of us that haven't, It is a horror film based on a novel created by Stephen King. The movie It is about a group of children trying to survive being hunted down by a killer clown named Pennywise. It is a really good film, both the original and the remake. If you have not watched it yet, I encourage you to do so. Now, a lot of people assume that the movie It is fake and could never happen in real life. But what if I told you that a killer clown did exist? Today, we will be taking a look at John Wayne Gacy, a real killer clown. John Wayne Gacy was born March 17th, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. John didn't have the best childhood. He did grow up in a two-parent household, but his father was a violent alcoholic. John's father was very abusive, both verbally and physically. John's mother tried to shield her son from her husband's abuse, but it only made his father more violent. John's father would often beat John's mother. Sometimes he would even beat her in front of John. John was also molested as a child by a family friend, but he never told anyone. Growing up, John struggled with his weight. He was usually one of the more bigger kids in class. He would often get teased about his size from other children as well as his father. John also had a hard time accepting his sexuality. From an early age, he knew he was attracted to men. He would sneak and buy gay pornographic magazines. Despite his lust for the same sex, he was too ashamed to come out and would date women in order to mask his true desires from the public. Due to the stress of his home life, John dropped out of high school in his senior year and left Chicago for Las Vegas, Nevada. John worked as an ambulance driver and then a mortuary assistant for a while in Nevada. After some time in Nevada, John became homesick and decided to come back home to Chicago. Despite his lack of a high school diploma, John managed to get into Northwestern Business College and he graduated in 1963. After college, John got a job with Nunbush, a men's shoe company, and it was at this job where he met and married his first wife, Marilyn Myers. John and Marilyn married in September 1964. Marilyn came from a wealthy family, and shortly after John and Marilyn married, Marilyn's father purchased three Kentucky Fried Chicken KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. Marilyn's dad took a liking towards John and offered him a job as a manager of all three KFC restaurants. John accepted the offer and him and his wife moved to Waterloo, Iowa. John mainly employed teenagers at his restaurant. John would often flirt and make sexual advances at the teenage boys, and when any of them tried to complain, he would just pretend he was joking. While balancing being a manager for three fast food restaurants, John also got involved in local politics. John would often host political events in his neighborhood. These events were portrayed to the community to be a place where people could come to discuss things they'd like to fix in their community. But in reality, these events were nothing like that. John and his neighbors would use these events to drink, watch pornography, do hard drugs, and participate in sex orgies with prostitutes. Because of John's crazy parties, John became very popular in his town. John and Marilyn had two children together, a son in 1966 and a daughter in 1967. In 1967, John sexually assaulted 15-year-old Donald Voorhees. Donald was one of John's neighbor's kids, and John convinced Donald to come back to his house by promising him that he would let him see one of his porno movies. Once in his house, John got Donald drunk and tricked Donald into giving him oral sex. John also gave Donald oral sex while he was intoxicated. After Donald, John started sexually assaulting other neighborhood teenagers and children in a similar fashion. In March 1968, Donald told his father that John had sexually assaulted him. Donald's father immediately informed the police, and John was arrested and charged with performing oral sodomy on a minor. John was convicted of sodomy on December 3rd, 1968, and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment to be served at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. Right after John's conviction, his wife Marilyn filed for divorce and requested she receive full custody of her children as well as full ownership of their house and their cars. Marilyn ended up getting everything she wanted, and John lost everything and never saw his first two children or his wife again. While in prison, John got a job and went back to school. He even managed to get his high school diploma. While locked up, John's father passed away. Despite his lengthy sentence, John was let out early due to good behavior. John was granted parole with 12 months of probation on June 18, 1970. Once released from prison, John went back to Chicago to stay with his mother. While staying with his mother, John began to assault local children and teenagers again. But it would take the police some time before they could catch him again. With the help of his mother, John managed to buy a ranch house in Chicago, and it was in this new home where John's crimes became more extreme and he began to murder his victims. In 1972, John married his second wife, high school sweetheart Carol Hoff. Carol and her two young daughters from a previous marriage quickly moved into John's house. While in his relationship with Carol, John started a construction business called PDM Contractors. PDM standard for painting, decorating, and maintenance. John mainly hired young men and teenagers. John's construction business slowly became very successful and lucrative. John also picked up interest in clowns after learning about a local clown club called the Jolly Joker. The Jolly Joker Clown Club was a nonprofit organization in Chicago whose members regularly performed dressed as clowns at fundraising events, parades, and hospitals for sick children. John joined the club around 1975, and when he wasn't working, he would spend most of his time performing as a clown at local events for children. John practiced often on his clown routine. He learned how to do tricks, and people were always impressed with his performances. He quickly became popular amongst the parents in the community, and he was often specifically requested for events. When dressed as a clown, John would often be left alone with groups of children with no other parental supervision. He would use these opportunities to do and say inappropriate things to the kids, usually of a sexual nature. Despite his business doing well and being beloved by his community, John and Carol's marriage was falling apart. Early into their marriage, John became less interested in his wife sexually and became addicted to gay porn. It got so bad that John just stopped having sex with his wife altogether. On 1976, March the 2nd, John and Carol divorced. John kept his house, and Carol and her two daughters moved into an apartment. Now, with an empty home, John no longer had to sneak young men and boys over. John committed most of his murders and sexual assaults after his second divorce between the years of 1976 and 1978. John would find a lot of his teenage victims from bus stops and hitchhiking. John would also use his construction business to find young men. John would get his child victims from around his own neighborhood and the events he did as a clown. John would lure his victims back to his house by using his home as a place to conduct interviews with people he promised jobs at his construction company. John would also get teenagers and boys to come over by promising them free drugs, alcohol, and porn films. Once inside, John would get his victims really drunk or high, sometimes both, and then put a show on for them. John's performance consisted of tricks he learned as a clown. Sometimes he would get fully dressed in his clown costume before his performance, but sometimes he wouldn't. One trick he did often consisted of him using a pair of handcuffs. He would put the handcuffs on himself and then break free without the use of keys. Then he would offer to teach his victims the same trick. His victims would usually agree, and John would place the handcuffs on his victims. But when it came time to teach them how to release themselves, he wouldn't do it. Instead, he would physically assault his victims into submission, tie their legs up, and then proceed to rape, torture, and finally kill them. John would store the dead bodies of his victims underneath his house. After many years of murdering, John was eventually caught. The disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest led cops to John's house. Robert's family filed a missing persons report after Robert didn't return home. After an investigation, it was discovered that John was the last person to be seen with Robert. Once the cops realized this, they were able to obtain a search warrant for John's home. Once inside John's home, the police instantly knew something wasn't right due to the horrible smell coming from beneath the floors of John's house, as well as the belongings of other missing young men scattered all around John's house. The police dug underneath John's house and discovered his victims. There were 29 boys and young men beneath John's home. 4 other bodies were also found in a nearby river close to John's home and later identified as John's victims. John confessed to his murders after the discovery of his victims, and he was taken into custody. In total, John killed 33 young men between 1972 and 1978. At his trial, John pled innocent by reason of insanity, but he was rejected by the jury. John was found guilty of all 33 murders of which he was accused of, and he was executed through lethal injection on 1994. If you enjoy our content, please like, comment, and subscribe.